Three divers are squeezing through a suffocatingly narrow underwater tunnel. Suddenly, a corpse entangled in guidelines appears out of nowhere, completely blocking the path. Before the lead diver can even process what he's looking at, his teammate right behind him begins to convulse violently without warning. At the very back of the line, the last diver panics and starts swimming frantically in the opposite direction. But here's the kicker. The entrance they came from has somehow frozen shut. If you were trapped in the middle, what would you do? This is the chilling reality of today's story. The Plura cave diving disaster. Located in the Plura Valley of Norway, just inside the Arctic Circle, the Plura cave is a massive subterranean river system carved out by flowing water over millions of years. Total length, over 2.1 miles. Maximum depth, 443 feet. The narrowest passageways are less than 3 feet wide. The water temperature hovers near freezing year-round, but the visibility is insane, often exceeding 300 feet. Under the divers' lights, the white marble walls reflect a haunting, ethereal blue glow. But beneath this breathtaking beauty lies a lethal trap. On February 6, 2014, 5 elite Finnish divers arrived at the site. Patrick, Huotarinen, Vesa, Usimaki, and Kai. These men weren't amateurs. They were all fully certified cave divers with an average of over 10 years of experience. In fact, Patrick and Kai had successfully completed this exact dive a year prior. This time, they decided to do a reverse traverse. They would enter through a frozen pond, swim 1.8 miles through the cave system, and emerge from a dry cave on the other side. The estimated dive time was 5 hours. They split into 2 groups to avoid kicking up silt and blinding each other. Team 1, the advanced team, Patrick and Huotarinen. Team 2, the follow-up team, Vesa, Usimaki, and Kai, stepping into the water 2 hours later. They were equipped with state-of-the-art rebreathers, top-tier gear, and a meticulously calculated plan. But the brutal rule of cave lawn is simple. The more perfect the plan, the more fatal the unexpected. At 12 p.m., Patrick and Huotarinen cut through the surface ice and dove in. An hour later, they smoothly reached the deepest section of the cave, marked their guidelines, and began their ascent. A short while later, Patrick, who was leading, glanced back. The tunnel behind him was pitch black. Huotarinen was gone. Then, he spotted a dive light violently thrashing in the distance. It was a frantic distress signal. Patrick immediately turned around and swam back into a living nightmare. Huotarinen was hopelessly wedged in a narrow restriction at a depth of 360 feet. His backup gas tank was jammed against the rocky ceiling, and the loose guidelines had wrapped around him like a spiderweb. Patrick desperately tried to untangle his friend, but the tunnel was so tight, there was simply no room to maneuver. Huotarinen spiraled into a blind panic, and his breathing turned into hyperventilation. At that depth, his rebreather hit its absolute filtration limit, triggering a condition known as hypercapnia. Blinded by panic and starving for air, Huotarinen tried to switch to an alternative breathing regulator but failed to get a proper seal. He inhaled a mouthful of ice-cold lake water, went into violent convulsions, and drowned within minutes. Suddenly, Patrick's dive computer began blaring a piercing alarm. Because he had stayed behind so long to save his friend, his required decompression time had skyrocketed from 120 minutes to a staggering 400 minutes. Worse, the panic had burned through his oxygen. His tanks were less than half full. He had no choice but to leave his friend's body behind and swim for his life. Facing a guaranteed death from running out of air, he intentionally skipped the majority of his decompression stops, literally gambling his life on a tiny chance of survival. Meanwhile, up on the surface, Team 2 had no idea their friends were in trouble. 2 hours after the first launch, Vesa, Usimaki, and Kai dropped into the water right on schedule. The first half of the dive was textbook perfect. They swam through an 800-foot-long air chamber, descended to the deepest point, saw Team 1's markers, and began their ascent. But as Vesa reached that same narrow twisting restriction, he froze. A body was completely blocking the tunnel. It was Huotarinen. His corpse was wedged dead center, totally sealing the path. Vesa had no idea what went wrong. Forcing himself to stay calm, he unclipped his bulky gear and attempted to painstakingly squeeze his body through the tiny gap between the corpse and the rock wall, while signaling a warning to the guys behind him. But when Usimaki, the middle diver, saw the corpse of his friend, his mental defense line shattered. He was the least experienced of the 5. Numbed by cold and blind terror, his survival instinct misfired. He began struggling frantically, his breathing spiraled out of control, and his wild kicking churned up a massive cloud of silt. In a split second, visibility dropped to absolute zero. Kai, bringing up the rear, was blinded by the mud. All he could hear through the water was the chaotic metallic clanging of scuba gear bashing against the rocks. The noises grew louder, then more frantic, and then they began to fade. After just 3 minutes, the tunnel went dead silent. Usimaki had also succumbed to CO2 toxicity and suffocated. Now, two bodies completely plugged the narrow tunnel. It was a dead end. Put yourself in Kai's fins. What do you do? Go forward? Two bodies are blocking the path and you have no idea if Vesa is alive or dead on the other side. Go back? The return trip is astronomically longer and your gas supply might not last. Kai made his choice. He turned around and swam back alone. To conserve his remaining gas, he blew past almost all of his decompression safety stops. He swam back through the crushing blackness of the cave, utterly alone with his thoughts, guided only by the thin nylon line. Over 3 hours later, he finally reached the exit pond, only to find a cruel twist of fate. The hole they had cut through the ice that morning had frozen over. Using the absolute last ounce of his strength, he smashed through the ice crust, hauled himself onto the frozen surface, and crawled to their truck. He started the engine, blasted the heater, and collapsed onto the seat, blacking out. He fell asleep believing he was the sole survivor of the dive. But he didn't know Vesa was still breathing. On the other side of the blockage, Vesa had made a different bet. He stripped off most of his gear and violently forced his way past Huatarinen's corpse. He made it. A while later, at a depth of about 20 feet, he spotted Patrick, who was hanging onto a line performing desperate, improvised decompression stops. The two survivors locked eyes in the abyss. They didn't have the energy to speak. They just stared at each other in shock. Late that night, Patrick and Vesa finally broke the surface. Walking up to the road, they saw the headlights of the truck. Kai was alive. Following the tragedy, the Norwegian police conducted a risk assessment and deemed a recovery mission far too dangerous. They officially sealed the cave and banned all diving. But for the three survivors, the real torment was just beginning. Kai developed severe PTSD and anxiety. He could never dive again. Vesa suffered permanent spinal damage from severe decompression sickness. Patrick was eaten alive by survivors' guilt after watching his friend die. They couldn't live with the fact that their brothers in arms were left to rot in a freezing, dark cave in a foreign land. 1 month later, they defied the government. They secretly gathered 17 of the world's most elite cave divers and covertly hiked back to the Plura cave. They hauled nearly 2,500 pounds of gear and pre-staged 50 backup gas cylinders throughout the cave system. The recovery team split into 2 groups, entering from opposite sides of the mountain. When they reached the restriction, one team pushed the bodies from behind, while the other team pulled from the front. On March 26th, both bodies were successfully brought to the surface. After retrieving their backup gear, the divers handed the remains and their helmet cam footage over to the Norwegian authorities, recognizing the purely humanitarian nature and the unparalleled professionalism of the rogue operation. The Norwegian police dropped all charges. 5 men went down, 3 came back, 2 stayed behind forever. But of the men who made it out, not a single one returned whole. When they risked their lives to go back into that black hole to bring their friends home, it wasn't an adrenaline rush or an adventure. It was a visual act of redemption. The Plura cave still sits quietly today deep in the Arctic Circle, waiting. It will never turn down the next challenger, but it makes no promises that you'll ever come back alive.